Good evening, everyone. I'm Alex Trezolio. Welcome to week 8, the last week of Introduction to the Middle Way. Before we start, I just want to invite us all just to take a moment to set our intention or aspiration. This week we're going to be talking about everything we do in life as practice, and listening to teachings is also practice. So just take a moment to set the intention that you're going to do this for the sake of enlightening all sentient beings. Just think about what that means in terms of how you would like to listen. Okay, so last week we completed Chandrakirti's text, the Madhyamakavatara. We spent quite some time on chapter 11 with enlightenment and the qualities of the Buddha, in particular emphasizing their inconceivability, which is what you'd expect, right? They're describing non-duality, and we know that we cannot reduce or express the non-dual in concepts and language. At best, we're going to have a finger pointing to the moon. We also talked about applying the view of non-duality in our meditation practice. So we talked about how it means changing our subject, our projections. We talked about cultivating equality, equanimity, preferencelessness, in the way that we want to ensure we treat others the same, no matter whether they are friend or enemy. We talked about learning to take accountability for our projections, as in Shantideva's chapter 6 from the Bodhicharyavatara on patience. How working with anger, he changed his stance from the opponent being the problem to himself being the problem. Just that idea of a radical transformation that emptiness enables. We also talked about compassion as a practical path to approach non-duality, which, as we said, is inconceivable. It's too abstract, right? It's very hard for us to figure out what it means to practice emptiness directly. But one of the wonderful things about the Buddhist path is that we have a complete gradual path based on bodhicitta, based on the paramitas, that help us to get there. So we're going to build on those ideas this week, especially the emphasis on compassion and working in our everyday lives, using that as practice. So again, we may run over a little bit in terms of timing this evening, but if you have to go, please don't worry, it shall be recorded and transcribed as usual. So the 10 bulls, the last of the 10 bulls, in the world. Barefooted and naked of breast, I mingle with the people of the world. My clothes are ragged and dust-laden, and I am ever blissful. I use no magic to extend my life. Now, before me, the dead trees become alive. Comment. Inside my gate, 1,000 sages do not know me. The beauty of my garden is invisible. Why should one search for the footprints of the patriarchs? I go to the marketplace with my wine bottle and return home with my staff. I visit the wine shop and the market, and everyone I look upon becomes enlightened. So I personally love that. The idea here of mingling with the people of the world, everyone I look upon becomes enlightened. This is very much what we touched upon last week, as in how does the Bodhisattva benefit sentient beings, right? This is the non-dual Bodhisattva out in the world, benefiting spontaneously and without dualistic intention. And this is another great thing that Buddhism offers us, because we have the example of the sage, of the Dzogchen yogi, as an example of non-duality. And yes, I know many of us would think of these as stories, as poetic, mythical perhaps. but I really want to encourage you to see them as actual role models. And as we said last week, I mean, having role models is critical in any journey of change. And that's one of the wonderful things we have, right? We do have these role models. So we're going to spend quite a lot of time this week exploring what it means to act in that kind of non-dual way. But as we said last week, the challenge is we don't know how to behave like that right away. We don't know what it means to practice non-duality. So we need some kind of gradual path of practice. And so I'd like to talk about both of those this week, both the non-dual way of being in the world and the gradual path of practice in the world that can lead us to non-duality. So in particular, we're going to talk about, again, the two truths, but this time not at an intellectual level, but what do they mean in practice? And then the classic Shravakayana and Mahayana paths of practice, right? The Eightfold Path and the Six Paramitas. And we'll look at those both as a gradual path and as a non-dual path. And along the way, I'll offer various quotes from Buddhist and non-Buddhist sources, again, with the aspiration to give us alternative, ways of understanding, ways of accessing these teachings, knowing that the path teachings resonate differently with each of us. So, the final stage of the hero's journey, and as we said last week, we're now in Act 3. And Act 3 is all about bringing our gift or our boon back into the world. And in this case, it's the gift of emptiness, that view. And when we think about generosity in the paramitas, we know it includes both material generosity and protection from fear, but the highest form is to teach the Dharma, to offer the truth. Right? So it's actually very appropriate that what we're going to give as our highest gift is our realization of emptiness. And we mentioned previously Joseph Campbell has a 17-stage model, and the last 3 stages of the hero's journey, I just want to read them briefly. Number 15 is called the crossing of the return threshold. Here the trick is returning and retaining the wisdom gained on the quest, to integrate that into a human life, and then figuring out how to share it with the rest of the world. So that's exactly what we're trying to do this week, right? How are we going to integrate it, and how through the course of our engagement with our world, how are we going to share that? Number 16, Master of Two Worlds. And here Campbell says, this step is usually represented by a transcendental hero like Jesus or the Buddha. For a human hero, it may mean achieving a balance between the material and the spiritual. The person has become comfortable and competent in both inner and outer worlds. And I would say, actually, I wouldn't use the word balance. I would use the word synthesis, because we're going beyond two opposites that we're somehow trying to find a middle point for. We're saying we're going beyond samsara, beyond nirvana, right? We're trying to synthesize and not be trapped in either pole, right? Not remaining in nirvana, not abandoning samsara. Number 17, freedom to live. Here Campbell says, mastery leads to the freedom from the fear of death, which in turn is the freedom to live. This is sometimes referred to as living in the moment, neither anticipating the future nor regretting the past. So, again, from a very different perspective and background compared to these middle way teachings, he's ending up in a place where the language sounds very similar. And this idea of giving our gift and sharing it with the world, I want to quote Toni Morrison, the author. She said, I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. This is not just a grab bag candy game. Okay, so the two truths. Now, we already saw at the end of chapter 6 in verse 226, the king of swans was flying on the two wings of the ultimate and the relative, wisdom and compassion. And we also heard the words of Guru Rinpoche Padmasambhava, though my view is as spacious as the sky, my actions and respect for cause and effect are as fine as grains of flour. So this is very much now talking about emptiness in the world, right? All about my actions, my respect for cause and effect. And we know that view without practice, view without action is just an intellectual understanding. It won't transform our meditation, it won't transform our action in the world. As Rinpoche says, 98% of the path is practice. And this week, we're not talking about practice simply in the sense of sitting on your meditation cushion, but how are you bringing your practice into the world? How are you using the rest of your day to practice, to actually embody and to realize this non-dual view? So your actions, your respect for cause and effect are just as important here. But the opposite is also true. If we're just paying attention to cause and effect in samsara, we are just ordinary, worldly, sentient beings, just trying to make sense of the world, make things work in the world, chasing after worldly happiness and success, and not actually practicing the Dharma. So until now, we've talked about the two truths intellectually. We've used language like ultimate truth and conventional truth. But for most of us, it's very confusing, right? We don't really know what it means. We don't really know what to do with it. But having said that, it is a central idea in these teachings, right? So I'd like to take it and find and explore some more practical ways of talking about it. And the first is from a wonderful article called Self-Transformation by Bhikkhu Bodhi, which is in the pre-reading, where he distinguishes what he calls self-transformation from self-transcendence. And as you'll see, this does actually correspond to the two truths, to wisdom and compassion. I'd just like to read from this. This desire for a transformed personality, for the emergence of a new man from the ashes of the old, is one of the perennial lures of the human heart. From ancient times, it has been a potent wellspring of the spiritual quest. And even in the secular, life-affirming culture of our own cosmopolitan age, this longing has not totally disappeared. Where previously this urge sought fulfillment in the temple, ashram, and monastery, it now resorts to new venues: the office of the psychoanalyst, the weekend workshop, the panoply of newly spawned therapies and cults. However, despite the change of scene and conceptual framework, the basic pattern remains the same. Disgruntled with the ruts of our ingrained habits, we long to exchange all that is dense and constrictive in our personalities for a new, lighter, freer mode of being. Self-transformation is also a fundamental goal of the Buddha's teaching, an essential part of his program for liberation from suffering. The Dhamma was never intended for those who are already perfect saints. It is addressed to fallible human beings beset with all the shortcomings typical of unpolished human nature: conduct that is fickle and impulsive, minds that are tainted by greed, anger, and selfishness, views that are distorted, and habits that lead to harm for oneself and others. The purpose of the teaching is to transform such people, ourselves, into accomplished ones, into those whose every action is pure, whose minds are calm and composed, whose wisdom has fathomed the deepest truths, and whose conduct is always marked by a compassionate concern for others and for the welfare of the world. What distinguishes the Buddhist program for self-transformation from a multitude of other systems proposing a similar end is the contribution made by another principle with which it is invariably conjoined, and this is the principle of self-transcendence, the endeavor to relinquish all attempts to establish a sense of solid personal identity. In the Buddhist training, the aim of transforming the personality must be complemented by a parallel effort to overcome all identification with the elements that constitute our phenomenal being. The teaching of anatta, or not self, is not so much a philosophical thesis calling for intellectual assent as a prescription for self-transcendence. It maintains that our ongoing attempt to establish a sense of identity by taking our personalities to be I and mine is, in actuality, a project born out of clinging, a project that at the same time lies at the root of our suffering. If therefore we seek to be free from suffering, we cannot stop with the transformation of the personality into some sublime and elevated mode as the final goal. What is needed, rather, is a transformation that brings about the removal of clinging, and with it the removal of all tendencies to self-affirmation. It is important to stress this transcendent aspect of the Dhamma, because in our own time, when immanent secular values are ascendant, the temptation is great to let this aspect drop out of sight. If we assume that the worth of a practice consists solely in its ability to yield concrete, this-worldly results, we may incline to view the Dhamma simply as a means of refining and healing the divided personality, leading in the end to a renewed affirmation of our mundane selves and our situation in the world. In the proper practice of the Dhamma, both principles, that of self-transformation and that of self-transcendence, are equally crucial. The principle of self-transformation alone is blind, leading at best to an ennobled personality, but not to a liberated one. The principle of self-transcendence alone is barren, leading to a cold, ascetic withdrawal devoid of the potential for enlightenment. So I love that, right? Very beautiful language around the two truths. As he said, no wisdom means you're blind, no compassion means you're barren. Right? We need both. And I love the way he's using very everyday language, right? Self-transformation, self-transcendence. We can relate to this in a way that's much more straightforward than ultimate and conventional truth. And then he talks about the path, and I think his summary there is also quite wonderful. He says, of the two principles, that of self-transcendence claims primacy both at the beginning of the path and at the end. For it is this principle that gives direction to the process of self-transformation, revealing the goal toward which a transformation of the personality should lead, and the nature of the changes required to bring the goal within our reach. However, the Buddhist path is not a perpendicular ascent to be scaled with picks, ropes, and studded boots, but a step-by-step training which unfolds in a natural progression. Thus, the abrupt challenge of self-transcendence, the relinquishing of all points of attachment, is met and mastered by the gradual process of self-transformation. By moral discipline, mental purification, and the development of insight, we advance by stages from our original condition of bondage to the domain of untrammeled freedom. So I love that idea that, the path to emptiness is like a steep cliff, right? It's too difficult for us to climb. Whereas the path of self-transformation, the path of bodhicitta, is something we can do, and it leads us to this path of self-transcendence. Okay, so that's one way of talking about the two truths. Another completely different way is from Rinpoche. Wonderful language he calls elegance and outrageousness. And this is very old, actually. It's a teaching on the Bodhicharyavatara that he gave in Berlin in 1990. So start with outrageousness. He said, many people think that outrageousness means being free, being able to express one's own emotions. They cry, they shout, they scream. They think outrageousness is connected with having a confident personality, like if you dye your hair and cut it in a different style and walk in the street in a very funny dress. People think that is very outrageous. But that is not outrageousness. It's just like another area of punk or yuppies. Anyway, to make a more precise definition, outrageousness means to do things genuinely and not to be a slave of society. Wearing a tie is not so important for being very elegant, but society has determined that elegant people should wear ties, and we have become slaves of that. We have to buy a tie, we have to learn how to wear it properly. We understand the difference between good and bad manners. And it's good to be able to go beyond that and find outrageousness. And even in Dharma practice, outrageousness is so important. It's almost like the display of bravery and courage. So we'll talk about this quite a lot, right? But Rinpoche goes on in that teaching to talk about, even in our practice, right, how we make offerings, how we visualize the deity. We come with such a poverty mentality, right? And he really wants to encourage us not to be limited. We talked about this in the last couple of weeks. But, going beyond narrow cultural confines and really trying to think in a more expansive, non-dual way. That is outrageousness. Doing things genuinely, not being the slave of whatever tribes or groups or society we might be part of. But elegance, he says, so you might think that it's contradictory to outrageousness, but a practitioner also has to be elegant. The way he walks, the way he sits, the way he dresses, the way he flips the pages of his sadhana, the way he beads the mala, the way he does meditation. Elegance is so important. And in order to be elegant, you may have to wear that tie, which we rejected earlier. The idea of elegance is to create the atmosphere. Everything, in Dharma practice and in life, atmosphere is so important. If you create the atmosphere nicely, then the Dharma practice also becomes nice. It's like when you go to a very special occasion, everyone's wearing nice dresses. It doesn't mean your mind becomes sharper, but somehow because of the atmosphere it helps. But when you go to Dharma centers and you're wearing a floppy dress and you sit on a floppy cushion, we could say the situation's very relaxed. We could also say it's very clumsy. So concentration and everything else becomes very clumsy. Elegance is not simply what you wear, but the way that you are, even at home when nobody is watching you. Right, so again, outrageousness is going beyond the relative, much more towards the non-dual, towards the ultimate, whereas elegance all about working within the conventional. So, I mean, and the rest of the teaching extends this distinction beyond practice and into life. So elegance is learning to work with conventional truth, the language, the norms of society. It's like when you're in Rome doing as the Romans do. Learning to empathize and connect and speak the language of our colleagues, our opponents, so we can build relationships and work together and get things done in the world. And likewise with our practice, not superimposing our own assumptions and ideas, but approaching situations with a genuine humility and openness, a desire to tame and adapt ourselves to the situation. So all this to say that action really matters, right? It matters, as Guru Rinpoche said, to do everything with care, as fine as grains of flour, right? To do whatever we do with excellence. Now, we've talked in previous weeks about the connection between early Dharma and some of the Greek philosophy, but this is very much the idea from Aristotle, right, of excellence or arete. So that means excellence of any kind. It could be moral virtue. And in its early appearance in Greek philosophy, it meant the notion of fulfillment of purpose or function, right? The idea of living up to one's full potential. And moral virtue, or the disposition to act with excellence, is something that we partly develop as a result of our upbringing and partly as a result of our habits, right? Our practice. And Aristotle argues in the Nicomachean Ethics that character arises from habit. Right? It's a skill that's acquired through practice, just like learning a musical instrument. Right? So again, this idea of practice, the idea of what we do in the world, in our day-to-day interactions, this is critical, right? Because that is where we repeat or create new habits, and that becomes our character. And it's actually very interesting because this idea of arete, there's an older idea in India, the Vedic concept of rta, very similar root linguistically. And this has the meaning of that which is properly or excellently joined, right? Order, rule, truth. And it's the principle of natural order which regulates and coordinates the operation of the universe and everything within it. And later, actually, as the sort of post-Vedic thought came to India, it became linked to how we uphold the order of the universe, as in the Dharma, and then the actions of individuals in relation to those practices, which is karma, right? And those eventually eclipsed the rta in terms of their importance. But many scholars say this idea of rta is one of the most important religious conceptions of the Rig Veda. And indeed, you could say it's the beginning of the history of Hindu religion. And Rinpoche himself will talk about our practice and conventional truth very much in terms of karma, in terms of action, in terms of accumulating merit and good karma. Right, so yes, I mean, we can think about this in some magical way, some beyond worldly storehouse of merit, but we can also think about it more accurately in terms of purifying our defilements and getting closer to the view of non-duality. Right, now outrageousness, again, learning to define ourselves, to author ourselves authentically without reference to the norms of society or our tribe or our social network. And that does not mean being a rebel, right? It doesn't mean being against society, because being against society is still in reference to society. It's going beyond either pro or anti, right? And it's not just society as a whole, it's any of our tribes, our family, our in-laws, our friends, our work colleagues, our sangha, our political party, whatever. And something we've come across before, Robert Keegan from Harvard, his work on self-authorship. I mean, he talks about the process very similar to the Dharma process, right? We start with what he calls a socialized self, right? This idea that we are slaves to conventional views, as Rinpoche put it. We rely on external rules. We rely on what our tribe, our elders, our parents, our society, our sangha tells us to do. And then at some point in stage 2, we reach some kind of conflict, right? Either we see different external authorities are now in conflict with each other, or we start to see that our internal values that are evolving, we can't make sense of them in terms of external rules. Right? The demands of our external sources of authority no longer fit. So then we have to figure out how to deal with those conflicts. And then finally in stage 3, we get to self-authorship, right? Where we go beyond external sources of reference and we define for ourselves what is our value system, what is our view. And as we said in week 1, this is actually really important for us in developing our own view of emptiness, right? Our own understanding, so that when we're in the world, when real life situations come up, we know what to do, right? Because we can't always send an email to our teacher to ask for advice, right? We need to know what can we do. And that's only going to happen if it's part of our theory in use, as we said before, right? So that's only going to happen if we self-author and create our own ideas, our own models, our own maps, our own view. So in ensuring our Dharma practice is authentic, yet again, view is so critical. Okay, so putting all this together, I think we have a much richer understanding of the two truths, right? So ultimate truth is self-transcendence, using Bhikkhu Bodhi's words. It's emptiness, it's wisdom, it's ultimate bodhicitta, and using Rinpoche's words, it's outrageousness. Whereas conventional truth, that corresponds to self-transformation, Bhikkhu Bodhi's words. That's purification and cultivation of compassion and skillful means. It's relative bodhicitta, and in Rinpoche's words, it's elegance. Okay, and as we've said so many times, we need both of the two truths, right? If we just go for self-transformation and elegance without self-transcendence, then it's just worldly self-help and personal development. There's nothing of the Dharma path there. But if we just attempt self-transcendence without the self-transformation, it's like trying to scale the cliff without really having the equipment. We'll end up fooling ourselves, right? We'll end up with spiritual materialism, ego, building our castles on a foundation of sand, and a high risk of falling into nihilism. Right, so just as we need both of the two truths when we establish the view, we also need both of the two truths in our practice. Right? We need ultimate and relative. We need self-transformation and self-transcendence. We need elegance and outrageousness. So on this topic, actually, of trying to go too far too fast, I think it's really important, right? Because this week we're talking about emptiness in the world, and there's some lovely recent work been done on a topic that people call spiritual bypassing, right? So if you don't deal with the stuff of the conventional world, of your conventional life, your conventional habits. So let me quote, this is from Bo Heimann, a piece in Leverkunst. He wrote, "There's another challenge that could emerge from meditation without a solid ground. It can, simply put, contribute to self-deception. excessive detachment, blind focus on positive thinking, fear of anger, artificial kindness, neglect of our own feelings, difficulty in setting limits, an intellectual understanding that is far ahead of emotional and moral intelligence. Focus on the absolute rather than the relative and the personal. Is there a bell ringing? Yes, the above is found in quite a few of us. It's quite common in Dharma circles. This term of spiritual bypassing was originally coined by the teacher John Welwood, and Robert Masters has a book of the same name where he talks about the road away from life's pain often ends up in a certain form of spiritual bypassing that keeps us in pain. Many meditators don't think they need to do important psychological work. They want to enjoy the mountaintop view by being hoisted up in a helicopter. But then we end up unreliable and vulnerable because the view is not deserved and supported from the inside out, but purchased. We have to climb all the way up if we want to be free. There are no shortcuts. We might love the big breakthrough and the view from the top of the mountain and not the small steps and the tough psychotherapeutic work that's needed to get there without a helicopter. We want this journey to be almost painless. But this illusory idea of a shortcut ends up being a detour, maybe even a cul-de-sac. And unfortunately, this easy shortcut is sold by spiritual second-hand car dealers. And we are up for grabs for empty calories because we would like to believe that we can do it in half the time. And yes, I think this idea that we're unwilling to look inside and just thinking that we can kind of go outside. A beautiful quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. He said, "If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" So we'll talk about this more, but for some, our view leads to our practice, although that's very hard, right? For more of us, our practice is going to lead to our view. So in other words, we're going to understand the view of non-duality through our practice, not necessarily prior to our practice. And in terms of balancing the elegance and outrageousness, Rinpoche has a lovely saying. He says, we should aim to be outwardly Shravakayana, inwardly Mahayana, and secretly Vajrayana. Right? So in other words, outwardly, we should be elegant, right? We should fit in beautifully. Inwardly, we should have this sense of non-duality and emptiness, right? This outrageousness, this willingness to step outside habit and convention, always in an elegant way. And then secretly, we have the pure perception, which we'll come to later. Finally, as we said last week, our aim is for the distinction between meditation and post-meditation to collapse entirely. So we've talked last week of meditation practice. Now this week, post-meditation. Why should we also use that as our practice? Well, a couple of reasons, right? Firstly, not fooling oneself. It's much easier to fool yourself about your practice and how well you're doing when you're sitting alone on your cushion. But when you're talking, when you're working with other people, when you're trying to be in a romantic or family or professional relationship, all of a sudden the gaps between your theory and your practice become very clear. Secondly, right, as Bhikkhu Bodhi said, self-transcendence is important at the beginning and at the end of the path, but in the middle, a lot of the hard work is self-transformation, just the work of cleaning the dirt from your window. Nothing glamorous, but that's exactly what we get to do in our ordinary lives. The third reason, right, just time. If you think about it, right, 30 minutes on the cushion means 23.5 hours a day when you're not on the cushion. Now, I know that many of you are following a 2-hour-a-day practice commitment, and some of you even more than that, but even that still leaves more than 90% of your day where you're not practicing. Right? Our lives are short. as the teachings say, this is a precious human rebirth where we've met the Dharma. We have the opportunity to practice. Surely we want to use as much of each 24-hour period as we can. Now, I mean, if you're practicing full-time, like 8 or 10 hours a day, as you might on a 3-year retreat, you can get to your 10,000 hours in 3 years, right? Hence the classic 3-year retreat. But as a matter of just arithmetic, if you're only practicing half an hour a day, to get to 10,000 hours, which as we've seen is the benchmark for mastery or really internalizing a practice, at half an hour a day, that's going to take you 55 years, right? So most of us, we don't have that long, right? So we're going to need to use more than just that half hour a day. You're going to want to use as much of the remaining 24 hours as you can as part of your practice. And the final reason is benefiting others, right? It's not just that the 10,000 hours seem like they're a long way away, but every day we're meeting a lot of people. We're engaging with others in the world. The sooner we can transform our own hearts and minds, the more we can ensure that we're benefiting the people that we meet. Right? And that is our aim as bodhisattvas. Rinpoche told a lovely story about someone who actually attended one of his 3-year retreats and worked for 5 years just doing a minimum wage job just to save for the flight and the accommodation to get to the retreat. And Rinpoche said, that practice was creating just as much merit as anything that person did during the retreat itself. So I think we should really remember that, because some of us have this very dualistic idea that we're only accumulating merit when we're on our cushions, but absolutely not, right? Everything we do in our day-to-day lives, that's just as much an opportunity to accumulate merit, to purify our defilements, to increase our understanding and realization of the view. Okay, so now, of course, practice is key, right? And since this is our last week together, it's really important that we focus on practice, on inspiration, and we've got this 10,000 hours to accomplish. And why not 20? Why not 30,000 hours? So I don't want to spend too much time on theory, but since this is also a program on Madhyamika, I want to just say just a few words, right? What does it mean to build an ethic, a theory of morals and ethics around non-self? And there's a lot of materials in the pre-reading. I really encourage you to read them. But the main point is that for most of us, our conventional Western ideas of morals and ethics are all based on free will and personal accountability. And how can any of that work when there is no truly existing self? So some of the Garfield readings in particular, he makes a lovely point that the key distinction is that action and ethics has to be based on dependent arising, right? The lack of a truly existing self, and not on the action of a free will bound by laws. Now this is, for those of us growing up in the West, very radical, right? We keep coming back to the notion of free will. We keep coming back to the idea of a self. We've seen it a lot in the forum discussions. We see it a lot all the time with questions that people ask about these things. But as we saw already in week 5, we now know the idea of free will is already falling apart in the light of the findings of cognitive science. And as we saw then, I think it's quite intriguing that contemporary science might end up shifting Western thinking on morality and on ethics to something that's much more aligned with the Buddhist perspective, right? Not centered on a non-existing self. And yes, this applies very much to our politics, to our institutional structures, to our organizations, right? What does it mean to design a workplace around the idea of non-self? Right, that's a huge and fascinating topic, which we're not going to have time for this evening. I'm going to focus much more on the personal implications, but just to note that that is all there as well. And so just to take a little bit from Garfield, from Engaging Buddhism, one of the pre-reading books, page 331, he says, our identities are negotiated, fluid, and complex, in virtue of being marked by the 3 universal characteristics of impermanence, interdependence, and the absence of any self. It is this frame of context-governed interpretive appropriation, instead of the frame of autonomous, substantial selfhood, that sets metaphysical questions regarding agency and moral questions regarding responsibility in a Buddhist framework. What is it to act in a way that's relevant to moral assessment or reaction? Is it for our behavior to be determined by reasons, by motives we and or others regard as our own? It is therefore for the causes of our behavior to be part of the narrative that makes sense of our lives, as opposed to being simply part of the vast uninterpreted milieu in which our lives are led, or bits of the narratives that more properly constitute the lives of others. This distinction is not a metaphysical, but a literary distinction. And since this kind of narrative construction is so hermeneutical, how we do so, individually and collectively, is a matter of choice, and sensitive to explanatory purposes. But that sensitivity, on the other hand, means the choice is not arbitrary. We can follow Nietzsche here. For what we do take responsibility, and for what we are assigned responsibility, those acts we interpret, or which others interpret for us as our own, as constituting part of the basis of imputation of our own identities. When I propose to jump for a window, for instance, in order to avoid living through global warming and the decline of Australian cricket, the conditions that motivate my act are cognitive and emotional states I take to be my own, and which others who know me would regard as mine. The narrative that constructs the conventional self that is the basis for individuation includes them, simply in virtue of our psychology and social practices. This, then, is uncontroversially, though merely conventionally, an action, and is a matter of direct moral concern for me and those around me. If, on the other hand, you toss me from the window against my will, the causes of my trajectory lie in what we would instead, and uncontroversially, but again on conventional hermeneutical grounds, interpret as parts of your biography. This is no action of mine. The agency lies with you, not on metaphysical grounds, but on conventional grounds. Not on the discover of agent causation in your will, not in mine, but based upon the plausible narrative we tell of the event and of each other's lives as interpretable characters. He notes, it's important to remember that not all narratives are equally good. Some make good sense of our lives or those of others. Some are incoherent. Some are facile and self-serving. Some are profound and revealing. It is possible for people to disagree about whether a particular event is an action or not, or about the attribution of responsibility. It is possible for us to wonder about whether we should feel remorse for a particular situation or not. These questions are, in the end, on this account, questions about which narratives make the most sense. While these questions may not always be easy, or even possible to settle, the fact they arise saves this view from the facile relativism that would issue from the observation that we can always tell some story on which this is an action of mine, and some story on which it is not, and so that there is simply no fact of the matter and perhaps no importance to the question. Okay, so I'm not going to go into any more detail on the theory, but I think just the takeaway for me is here the idea of accountability, agency, personhood, storytelling, all of these things are conventional narrative constructions, right? As we've been saying all these weeks, the idea of the self is just a narrative we tell ourselves. And so in that sense, you can talk about a selfless person and it can still make complete sense. Right? We can have a conventional construct of personhood, which is completely empty of any truly existing self. I also very much recommend actually chapters 4 and 5 of Garfield's book on what is self, what is consciousness, and in particular things like the minimal conception of self that the Prasangika Madhyamaka needs to actually have to engage in conventional truth. But enough theory. Let's turn to practice. Just a reminder, as Rinpoche said, look, the core of practice is being honest with ourselves. You know, as Milarepa sang, my religion is not deceiving myself and not disturbing others. So a couple of quotes. First, from the wonderful movie American Hustle. This is Irving Rosenfeld. He said, as far as I could see, people were always conning each other to get what they want. We even con ourselves. We talk ourselves into things, you know, we sell ourselves things we maybe don't even need or want. We're dressing them up. We leave out the risk. We leave out the ugly truth. We don't pay attention to that because we're all conning ourselves in one way or another just to get through life. So very, it's a lovely quote just to wonderful meditation, where in your own life are you not confronting the truth? Your relationships, your practice, your willingness to really be honest about how your life is going. Another quote, this one from George Orwell from 1946, a classic piece called In Front of Your Nose. The point is, we are all capable of believing things which we know to be untrue, and then, when we are finally proved wrong, impudently twisting the facts for us to show that we were right. Intellectually, it's possible to carry on this process for an indefinite time. The only check on it is that sooner or later a false belief bumps up against solid reality, usually on a battlefield. So I obviously hope none of us gets into the situation where our views are refuted on a battlefield, but I think this goes back to what we talked about in previous weeks, right? This idea of Rinpoche's teaching on 3 different kinds of student. Just can we hear the truth, or does it take some crisis in our lives before we're really willing to pay attention? So life as path, right? As we said, it's using everything that we have in our life for practice, right? Using work as a path, using relationships as a path. And actually, I wanted to quote, this is Rainer Maria Rilke from Letters to a Young Poet on love. He said, "It is good to love because love is difficult. For one human being to love another human being, that is perhaps the most difficult task that has been entrusted to us, the ultimate task, the final test and proof, the work for which all other work is merely preparation. That is why young people who are beginners in everything are not yet capable of love. It is something they must learn. With their whole being, with all their forces gathered around their solitary, anxious, upward-beating heart, they must learn to love. But learning time is always a long, secluded time, and therefore loving for a long time ahead and far on into life is solitude, a heightened and deepened kind of aloneness for the person who loves. Loving does not at first mean merging, surrendering, uniting with another person. For what would a union be of 2 people who are unclarified, unfinished, and still incoherent? It is a high inducement for the individual to ripen, to become something in himself, to become world in himself for the sake of another person. It is a great demanding claim on him, something that chooses him and calls him to vast distances. Only on this sense, as the task of working on themselves, many young people use the love that is given to them. Merging and surrendering in every kind of communion is not for them, who must still for a long, long time save and gather themselves. It is the ultimate. It is perhaps that for which human lives are as yet barely large enough. And another quote, His Holiness Dalai Lama, just on this idea of practice throughout our day, using each day fully. He said, every day, think as you wake up, today I am fortunate to be alive. I have a precious human life. I am not going to waste it. I am going to use all my energies to develop myself, to expand my heart out to others, to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. I am going to have kind thoughts towards others. I am not going to get angry or think badly about others. I am going to benefit others as much as I can. A very practical aspiration, and one that we can all include in our day. And again, as we said in week 1, right, this idea of deliberate practice, right, the 10,000 hours on the path to mastery, we can't just, be in cruise control. We have to test ourselves, right? It's like a military commander would say, you only know your soldiers when they're tested in the heat of battle. Also a lovely quote from Bruce Lee, where he said, under duress, we do not rise to our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. Yeah, so really, how do we use our everyday life to always keep ourselves on the edge of our comfort zone, to always keep pushing? Right? So I really invite you just to think how much are you doing that right now in your everyday life, right? Are you using it as a practice field for deliberate practice? And really, whatever your job is, that can be your practice field, right? So the idea of worldly wisdom, right? Even making better decisions, making better choices, right? We all have to make decisions all the time. And it's not our goal to get things right in the world, right? We're trying to renounce the world and go beyond it. But we can still use it as a field of practice, right? Like an artist might try and draw the perfect Enso, right? We can use feedback from situations. We can use feedback from people around us to gauge our progress, to actually practice non-duality. So whatever you do, that is your practice field. Rinpoche said, right? Just as he said, just as Ashoka created, the probably one of the most conducive environments ever for the study and practice of Dharma, we're going to need to think of how can we create things like that in the modern world, right? If we want an enlightened society, we will need Buddhist presidents, Buddhist CEOs, Buddhist scientists, right? So it's not just a matter of, learning. If we are part of any part of that, it's not just learning to do our job well for the sake of benefiting others. It's because it is our practice field. And interestingly, so even Aristotle, this idea of practical wisdom or phronesis, right? That was all about cultivating skill in worldly action. And even, the consulting firm McKinsey on its 80th anniversary published a review of everything it had written about strategy, and it concluded, the thing that makes the difference is not trying to get strategy right, it's about not making stupid mistakes. So very similar, right? It's all around cleaning the dirt from our windows, purifying our errors of judgment and understanding, seeing the truth more clearly. So this idea of approaching emptiness, whatever it is, if we're managers, if we're strategists, if we're artists, whatever our worldly profession might be, how can we use that profession as a way of practicing non-duality? All right, so now I'm going to go in the next two parts, right, through both the sort of self-transformation and then self-transcendence. Right, so looking at the Eightfold Noble Path, looking at the 6 parameters through both lenses. And we'll talk about this more as well, but when we talk about practice, Rinpoche made a very strong push to think of renunciation, Lojong, mind training. He said Dharma is not therapy, it's not to make you happy, but to disrupt you. It is to go against your habits and your ego. It's not to strengthen your daily life. Right, so just always bear that in mind when we think about worldly practice, right? We're not doing it in order to make our worldly life a success. Yes, we're interested in our practice field, so we care, just like Guru Rinpoche, that our action is as fine as flour. So if we are, managers, we want to manage well. If we're artists, we want to paint well. Right? But it's not for worldly outcomes, it's for the sake of our practice. We said, we quote Aristotle's idea of what is the good for the city and for the man, and there's so many answers, through the history of philosophy. I actually came across a lovely example from Gandhi where he was talking about what he called the 7 social sins. And he said, these are the 7 social sins: wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, knowledge without character, commerce without morality, science without humanity, worship without sacrifice, and politics without principle. And naturally, our friend does not want to know these things merely through the intellect, but to know them through the heart so as to avoid them. Yeah, so here he's really talking about self-transformation, right? So all of those are very worldly activities, and he's saying, how can we go about them in a way that is contributing to our spiritual progress. And all of these trade-offs, they're trade-offs of judgment, right? They're trade-offs of practical wisdom. So there's no short, sort of straightforward answers. It comes from our practice. So I mentioned already this idea that Rinpoche said, for some, their practice leads to their view. For some, their view leads to their practice. I'll say a little more about that. So first, practice leading to view. So we've talked about establishing the view and then practicing it, but that's difficult, right? The view is abstract, it's inconceivable, we can't understand it, and at the same time we have deep conventional habits of referring to ourself, to objects, to the workings of cause and effect, to karma, rebirth, all kinds of things, right? All the phenomena of the everyday world. So for us, we need to start by loosening our grip on our samsaric habits and wrong views. And this is what is meant by merit, right? Changing the qualities of our subject, our perceiver, cleaning the dirt off our window so we can see more clearly. And we do that through practice, right? So, take an example, generosity. Maybe when we start, we don't feel it at all, right? It's a pure chore. We do it because we're told we have to, right? Maybe it becomes a habit over time. And then maybe after a while, we actually start to feel it when we give to somebody. Maybe even further down the line, we might start to ask, what is the idea of giving? Gift, giver, receiver. On what basis is wealth and fairness even part of society, right? What does it mean to give a gift? So we might, if we really engage in generosity as a practice, we will find over time that it will start to undo some of our assumptions. We'll start to question things, right? By the way, that's if you're giving to a charity, I would strongly suggest don't make it a monthly direct debit, because you won't be thinking about it, right? It'll be out of your awareness. You won't be meditating on it, right? We really want to practice the paramitas. Yeah? We want to question our framing in terms of subject, object, and action and go beyond that. And so this is what is meant, right, when Rinpoche says for some their practice leads to their view. But even though we may not have the view yet solidly in place, we've done enough, hopefully in these 8 weeks, to understand the importance of not having an extreme view. And I want to tell a story. It's kind of a sad story of someone called George Price, who was a professor in London. And I think this is sort of an extreme view of generosity. What can go wrong if you don't have non-duality? He was an evolutionary theorist who did a wonderful piece of work which looked at natural selection and altruism, and it's called the Price equation, still considered the most accurate way of thinking about it. And he was interested in, why do organisms show altruism towards each other? And he found that it's the more genetically similar you are, the more you're likely to show altruism. So in a species like ours, where we need 2 parents to reproduce, we're more likely to show altruism to a parent, a full sibling, or a direct offspring. And this is because each of these relatives, on average, contains 50% of the genes in the original organism. So if for whatever reason we die as a result of an altruistic act, we can still propagate the genetic heritage as long as 2 or more of these close relatives are saved. But likewise, to a biological grandparent or a grandchild or a niece or a nephew or a half-sibling, we're going to show less altruism, right? Because that's only got a quarter of the genetic material. And then even less to a first cousin, where there's only an eighth of the genetic material, and so on and so forth. Right? The more further removed we are in terms of genetic material, the less likely organisms are to show altruism. And remarkably, this has been tested experimentally and is very robust. And I mean, Price was actually really disappointed with this, because it means that altruistic behavior is not really selfless at all. It's just an adaptation that organisms have to promote their own genetic heritage, right? Richard Dawkins called it much later the selfish gene. And Price became increasingly depressed by the implications of his work. He wanted to try and prove his theory right or wrong, and so he started to show generosity and random kindness to complete strangers, right? He spent the latter part of his life helping the homeless. He invited the homeless to live in his house. And when they became too much of a distraction, he started to sleep in his office. He gave up everything to help alcoholics. And yet, even as they stole his belongings, he did nothing. He just fell deeper into depression. He was eventually thrown out of his rented house due to a construction project. And then he became unhappy because he could no longer provide housing for the homeless. He moved into some squats and became so depressed that eventually he committed suicide. Now, I mean, I think it's a really sad story, but just an example, for all of us, if we try and apply generosity or any of the parameters without an understanding of the view, it's just going to become extreme. Okay, so I'm going to start with the Eightfold Path. And as you may know, this can be grouped into three, the Trishiksha, or the threefold training. So first is prajna, so wisdom, which includes right view and right intention or right thought. Second is shila, ethical conduct, which in the Mahayana would be compassion. This is right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Finally, samadhi, mental discipline or meditation, which there's three: right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration or right samadhi. And in practice terms, they're usually practiced first shila or ethics, then samadhi and mental discipline, and then finally prajna or wisdom. But also, as we've spoken, we go view, meditation, action, right? So you could also go prajna, samadhi, shila. As Rishi said, for some, practice leads to view, for some, view leads to practice. But I want to emphasize, right, as we listen to this, even for Mahayana or Vajrayana practitioners, as Rishi says, we should never look down on the Rutiyana, the Shravakayana. All of these practices we can equally use as non-dual practices. It is our foundation. Okay, so first, right view. And here I'm taking the view from the book What the Buddha Taught from Walpola Rahula. He says, right understanding is the understanding of things as they are, and it is the Four Noble Truths that explain things as they really are. Right understanding, therefore, is ultimately reduced to the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. It's the highest wisdom which sees the ultimate reality. So that, very much makes sense to us. And of course, in the Madhyamaka, we would express the Four Noble Truths in terms of emptiness. There's a nice quote here on kind of view, ultimate and relative. If you ever saw Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln, there's a part of the film where Thaddeus Stevens, the passionate abolitionist who had no time for slave-owning whites, he scolds Lincoln for compromising with them. Because Lincoln's goal was total abolition, and he believed that the way to get there was passion matched with strategy. So the scene in the movie goes, Thaddeus Stevens says, you claim you trust them, but you know what the people are. You know that the inner compass that should direct the soul toward justice has ossified in white men and women, north and south, into utter uselessness through tolerating the evil of slavery. White people cannot bear the thought of sharing this country's infinite abundance with Negroes. And Lincoln said, a compass, I learned when I was surveying, will point you true north from where you're standing, but it has no advice about the swamps and the deserts and the chasms you will encounter along the way. If in pursuit of your destination you plunge ahead, heedless of obstacles, and achieve nothing more than to sink in a swamp, what is the use of knowing true north? Our virtues become vices when they blind us to the complexity of living. If you are a compass, keep pointing. If you are a map maker, we have work to do. Real progress depends on it. And first we must understand the landscape. Sometimes to cross the river, you have to backtrack, but by God, we'll cross it. Right, so lovely there. I think the idea that, right view, yes, emptiness, but not in any sense despising the complexity of the conventional truth. Okay, right intention, right thought. Rahula. Right thought, right intention denotes the thoughts of selfless renunciation or detachment, thoughts of love, thoughts of nonviolence, which are extended to all beings. It's very interesting and important to note here that thoughts of selfless detachment, love, and nonviolence are grouped on the side of wisdom. This clearly shows that true wisdom is endowed with these noble qualities, and that all thoughts of selfish desire, ill will, Hatred and violence are the result of a lack of wisdom in all spheres of life, whether individual, social, or political. So yeah, this idea of then how do we cultivate the right intention, right? And love itself being on the side of wisdom. As a lovely quote from Martin Luther King, loving your enemies. Now, this is obviously in a Christian context, but I want to encourage you to focus on the non-dual meaning here. He says, the meaning of love is not to be confused with some sentimental outpouring. Love is something much deeper than emotional bosh. Perhaps the Greek language can clear our confusion at this point. In the Greek New Testament, there are 3 words for love. The word eros is a sort of aesthetic or romantic love. In the Platonic dialogues, eros is the yearning of the soul for the realm of the divine. The second word is philia, a reciprocal of love and the intimate affection and friendship between friends. We love those whom we like, and we love because we are loved. The third word is agape, understanding and creative redemptive goodwill for all men, an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. Agape is the love of God operating in the human heart. At this level, we love men not because we like them, nor because they possess some type of divine spark. We love every man because God loves him. At this level, we love the person who does an evil deed, although we hate the deed that he does. Now we can see what Jesus meant when he said, love your enemies. We should be happy that he did not say, like your enemies. It is almost impossible to like some people. Like is a sentimental and affectionate word. How can we be affectionate towards a person whose avowed aim is to crush our very being and place innumerable stumbling blocks in our path? How can we like a person who's threatening our children and bombing our homes? This is impossible. But Jesus recognized that love is greater than like. Yes, again, we wouldn't use that language exactly, but I think the idea of common humanity that we're cultivating in bodhicitta, right? The equanimity of wanting to see all sentient beings the same way as we extend our love, our compassion, our joy, our equanimity. It's the same idea, right? And that, as we said previous weeks, that is an emptiness practice, right? So notice for yourself, can you love all equally or not? And if not, perfect whatever defilements there are which are stopping you seeing them that way. Okay. Third, right speech. Rahula. Right speech means abstention, 1, from telling lies, 2, from backbiting and slander, and talk that may bring about hatred, enmity, disunity, and disharmony among individuals or groups of people. 3, from harsh, rude, impolite, malicious, and abusive language. And 4, from idle, useless, and foolish babble and gossip. When one abstains from these forms of wrong and harmful speech, one naturally has to speak the truth, has to use words that are friendly and benevolent, pleasant and gentle, meaningful and useful. One should not speak carelessly. Speech should be at the right time and place. If one cannot say something useful, one should keep noble silence. So again, I mean, most of us, our lives live in the realm of communication, whether we're written or verbal. And just to notice, right, as he said, how are we reactive? How do we desire to manipulate others, to be liked, to be popular, to get ahead, right? How are we manifesting the 8 worldly dharmas? And again, perfect emptiness practice there, right? Just to really hold ourselves to account. So not one of the Eightfold Noble Path, but I mean, one could also just in parentheses here, just talk a little bit about conflict, right? Because conflict is endemic in samsara, right? In relationships, in work, in politics. And if you think about it, conflict is the ultimate expression of duality, right? So practice in working with conflict in our lives is an excellent practice of non-duality. And conflict arises when we reify the world into self and other, right? With solid boundaries, with different interests, even within ourselves. Right, as we said last week, we have issues of hesitation and doubt. And that is due to inner conflict, maybe between our instincts and the Dharma, right? But all conflict comes down to these bad maps of the world. We've also talked about, how do we bring the Dharma to the West? The notion of Dharma and science, or Dharma and Western philosophy, or Dharma and Western cognitive science, right? Many of us see conflicts there, right? Again, we are imposing our dualistic frames onto the world. How can we work with that? Another ubiquitous form of conflict is change, right? From the current version of ourselves to the future desired version of ourselves, right? Even as bodhisattvas on the path, any version of change involves conflict, right? So, working with conflict then is a practice of non-duality. And there's a lot more we could say, I guess, beyond the scope of what we're going to cover tonight. But just the idea of going back to what Rinpoche said about elegance and outrageousness, right? Outrageousness is going beyond our tribal self. Right, so back to Keegan Arbor, he said, what he calls the socialized self, because we're fixed to the views of our tribe or our family or our society, whatever, conflict becomes hardened. It becomes win-lose, right? We can't go against our loyalty to our tribe, to our ideas. Once we go to a self-authoring self, right, what Rinpoche calls outrageous, now then we can have win-win, right? Because now we are flexible. We can self-author, so we can change our views. Our views are not determined in terms of loyalty to our tribe. And then, of course, finally, we transcend, right, the self-transcendence that Bhikkhu Bodhi talked of. We go beyond even self-authorship to self-transcendence. And now it is non-dual, right? It's not about a win-win anymore. It's not about resolving a conflict. It's about letting the conflict transform us. And so that is conflict as non-dual practice. So a lot of it is just as in the rest of our emptiness practice, right? It's around understanding our wrong views, our incomplete maps, our bad assumptions, and our internal complex, right? When we're in over our heads, when we have two opposed rules that we cannot make sense of, right? Our incomplete map internally. And so we ask ourselves, can we learn to listen rather than react? Can we learn to find wisdom in our opponent's position? Right? Rather than assume that we know what's right, how can we learn to look for the truth, to deliberately question, to approach a conflict with beginner's mind? And of course it's hard, right? Because usually in a conflict we're emotionally triggered. We become defensive, we withdraw into ourselves. We're less likely to extend ourselves to our opponent. But such an important practice. Okay, back to the Eightfold Path, the fourth, right action or right discipline. So Rahula says, right action aims at promoting moral, honorable, and peaceful conduct. It admonishes us that we should abstain from destroying life, from stealing, from dishonest dealings, from illegitimate sexual intercourse, and that we should help others lead a peaceful and honorable life in the right way. Right, traditionally, it's the 5 vows of abstaining from harming living beings, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and intoxication. I guess one important way we can practice this for emptiness is not, as we saw this in chapter 2 of Madhyamaka, not becoming puritanical, right? Not becoming superior in our moral, in our ethic, in our dharma. Not thinking that our understanding is better, our practice is better. Rinpoche, as we said before, he's talking a lot nowadays about bad Buddhists, right? People who don't necessarily hold to all the vows, just ordinary householders, right? We do not want to exclude them from the Buddha's wisdom and compassion, right? So just again, to watch ourselves. When we think about our discipline, is it becoming something tribal, something exclusionary, or is it a way that we can practice and then benefit others? So right livelihood, number 5. Rahula. It means we should abstain from making our living through a profession that brings harm to others, such as trading in arms and lethal weapons, intoxicating drinks, poisons, killing animals, cheating, and so on, and should live by a profession which is honorable, blameless, and innocent of harm to others. So, again, how might that relate to emptiness? Well, Rinpoche has talked a lot about, not getting caught up in the rat race in fame and fortune and worldly success. I mean, he's talked about one of the best jobs is being a plumber, right? How many of us would really embrace that, right? That's pretty quite why he chose that. And we have all these glorious ideas of success or inspiration or passion or fulfillment. I mean, all these samsaric delusions, right? I think the other way we can think about it is just in terms of interdependence, right? Looking at our role as producers and consumers, right? Looking at the products we buy, looking at the impact of our actions, right? So upstream and downstream consequences. What are the social impacts? What are the environmental impacts of how we live, of what we buy, right? We can choose to take this very seriously as a practice of emptiness. Why not, right? Okay, number 6, right effort. For Rahula, it's the energetic will to prevent evil and unwholesome states of mind from arising. 2, to get rid of such evil and unwholesome states that have already arisen. 3, to produce or cause to arise good and wholesome states of mind that have not yet arisen. And 4, to develop and bring to perfection the good and wholesome states that are already present. Number 7, right mindfulness. Rahula, right mindfulness is to be diligently aware, mindful, and attentive with regard to the 4 foundations of mindfulness, right? So it's activities of the body, kaya, sensations or feelings, vedana, activities of the mind, chitta, and ideas, thoughts, conceptions, things, views, dhamma. So we've seen this in previous weeks as well, right? But yeah, very much a core emptiness practice. First, just learning to see all phenomena as impermanent, eventually see them all as empty. Seeing all our narratives and views as empty. Right? We've already talked on the emptiness of emptiness. Realizing that none of these 4 foundations, right, none of the skandhas are me or self. And then if you do this properly, right, mindfulness becomes an experiential way to establish the lack of true existence of the person. Now, as we've said in previous weeks, very different from how mindfulness is currently taught in the West, where it's all about solidifying the self and worldly ambition, right? More successful, more productive, less stressed, more happy, and so on. But if practiced according to the Dhamma, then yes, right mindfulness is a very powerful emptiness practice. Okay, number 8, right samadhi or right concentration. 4 stages. The first stage, so this is the 4th stage of dhyana or trance. The first stage of dhyana, passionate desires and some of the unwholesome thoughts like sensuous lust, ill will, languor, worry, restlessness, and doubt are discarded. And feelings of joy and happiness are maintained along with some mental activities. It's just worth pointing out, I know some of us in previous weeks have talked about skepticism as being a positive quality that we Westerners like to believe we possess. In the teachings, if we're actually practicing, we will see that even of the first of the 4 dhyanas, that has gone. In the second stage, all intellectual activities are suppressed. Tranquility and one-pointedness of mind are developed, and the feelings of joy and happiness are still retained. In the third stage, the feeling of joy, which is an active sensation, also disappears, while the disposition of happiness still remains, in addition to mindful equanimity. In the 4th and final stage, all sensations, even happiness and unhappiness, joy and sorrow, disappear. Only pure equanimity and awareness remain. Yeah, so again, even in the Shravakayana, very much this idea of equanimity and awareness, it's what we've talked about in the Heart Sutra, form and emptiness, emptiness and awareness, equanimity and awareness, using the Shravakayana language. And yeah, very much an emptiness practice, right? I think for many of us, we're very attached to our emotions, our practice experiences, especially so-called positive experiences like joy or happiness or insight or visions of the Buddha, who knows, right? But all this has to go. And to the extent that we are either attached to them or even positively seeking to reproduce them, these are obstacles for our practice, right? As Rinpoche said, it is not for happiness. Many of you wrote to me and asked, is there some practice advice for how we can approach specific worldly activities? And there's actually a short teaching from Rinpoche, which I'm going to read in full and then post on the site. It's called Applying the 3 Supreme Methods, which is sometimes called good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. So here Rinpoche says, if we approach an offering of service with basic good intention, then we accumulate merit. But when the 3 wholesome attitudes, known as the 3 supreme methods, are genuinely applied, evenly and outwardly mundane tasks can become a paramita. So first, Begin by refining your intention, thinking you'll perform the work for the sake of all sentient beings. Remember, you're not making an offering of service to boost your self-gratification, recognition, or mileage points. As Shantideva said, look upon yourself as a utensil and think, I have offered my body to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. May I be a guard for those who are protectorless, a guide for those who journey on the road. For those who wish to go across the water, may I be a boat, a raft, a bridge. She said, since it's going to be very difficult to remember to apply the 3 wholesome attitudes with every page you photocopy or every stroke of the scrubbing brush, before your day of work, you should recite the following prayer. Even the remembrance of your name dispels the hope and fear of nirvana and samsara. From now until attaining enlightenment, I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Following all the bodhisattvas of past, present, and future, may I emulate their infinite activity to free beings from suffering. Eventually, may I manage to surrender everything I have, my time, my space, my belongings, even my very limbs for the sake of all beings. In that aim, I shall begin by sacrificing my energy and time today to, and here you can insert whatever your job is, your task is, your practice field is, your volunteer work, and just add it. Okay, that's the first. The second wholesome attitude, and she says, avoid the pride that shadows your good intention. Remember, the work and its accomplishment is an illusion. If you can maintain this attitude throughout your task, it is ideal, but most likely you'll forget. So immediately after reciting the prayer above, you should reflect in this way. Whatever I do today is ultimately just a concept. Relatively, there is a necessary structure, just as there is in dreams. Though in dreaming there is no true direction, when I dream of falling, I fall down towards the earth, not up towards the sky. Ultimately, the direction makes no difference, since I never fell. But in the relative world of the dream, the construct of the way to fall is still needed. So I shall do my job as properly as possible. Yeah, so very similar to what we talked about previously about, Guru Rinpoche saying, as fine as the grain of flour. Finally, third dedication. This is from Bodhicharyavatara. This is chapter 10, verse 55. And now, as long as space endures, as long as there are beings to be found, may I continue likewise to remain, to drive away the sorrows of the world. And Rinpoche said, ideally you do this when you finish your work, but since you may forget, the merit can be offered at the beginning by thinking, I will dedicate whatever virtue results from my actions to all sentient beings. Yeah, so again, you see that we're already, even in our ordinary work, we're going beyond just the sort of work itself to a paramita, right? We're trying to bring the view of emptiness, the idea of illusion, the dreamlike manifestation into the work itself. Just in passing, I mean, we've said this before, I just want to say it again, right? The path is about removing defilements, right? It's about cleaning our window. So a lovely quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in Terre des Hommes. He said, perfection is attained not when there is no longer anything to add, but when there is no longer anything to take away. So I love that. I think it's a nice introduction also to the 6 paramitas. Just, now that we're talking about, the Mahayana, right, the grand intention, the grand path, there's a lovely quote from George Bernard Shaw from Man and Superman, actually the epistle dedicatory to the play, where he says, this is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch which I have got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. Right, and I love that. I mean, it could be a Dharma teaching. Beautiful. Completely different, but a thought from Elon Musk, where he said, if something is important enough, even if the odds are against you, you should still do it. Right, so again, I mean, I know sometimes Rinpoche said the notion of enlightening all sentient beings, it seems inconceivable, it seems impossible, but it's the most important thing there is to do, so we should still do it. Okay, the 6 parameters, I mean, we've been through them in the first 6 chapters, right? Just to review, generosity is the first, then discipline, third is patience, fourth is diligence, fifth is concentration, finally wisdom. I strongly recommend you read chapter 2 of Words of My Perfect Teacher, which is on arousing bodhicitta. Really excellent overview, especially the link between relative and ultimate, right? So between the sort of parameters in the world and then emptiness. And actually, I'd like to read a section on the transition from relative to ultimate and how view informs practice. So this is from pages 255 to 256. So Drom Trungpa once asked Atisha, what was the ultimate of all teachings? Of all teachings, the ultimate is emptiness, of which compassion is the very essence, replied the master. It is like a very powerful medicine, a panacea which can cure every disease in the world. And just like that very powerful medicine, realization of the truth of emptiness, the nature of reality, is the remedy for all the different negative emotions. Why is it then, Drom Trungpa went on, that so many people who claim to have realized emptiness have no less attachment and hatred? Because their realization is only words, Atisha replied. Had they really grasped the true meaning of emptiness, their thoughts, words, and deeds would be as soft as stepping on cotton wool or as tsampa soup laced with butter. The master Aryadeva said that even to wonder whether or not all things were empty by nature would make samsara fall apart. True realization of emptiness, therefore, is the ultimate panacea, which includes all the elements of the path. The next section is actually a lovely direct teaching on the 6 parameters. How can every element of the path be included within the realization of emptiness? Drom Trungpa asked. All the elements of the path are contained in the 6 transcendent perfections. Now, if you truly realize emptiness, you become free from attachment. As you feel no craving, grasping, or desire for anything within or without, you always have transcendent generosity. Being free from grasping and attachment, you are never defiled by negative actions, so you always have transcendent discipline. Without any concepts of I and mine, you have no anger, so you always have transcendent patience. Your mind made truly joyful by the realization of emptiness, you always have transcendent diligence. Being free from distraction, which comes from grasping at things as solid, you always have transcendent concentration. As you do not conceptualize anything whatsoever in terms of subject, object, and action, you always have transcendent wisdom. Do those who've realized the truth become Buddhas simply through the view of emptiness and meditation? Drom Trungpa asked. Of all that we perceive as forms and sounds, there is nothing that does not arise from the mind. To realize that the mind is awareness indivisible from emptiness is the view. Keeping this realization in mind at all times and never being distracted from it is meditation. To practice the 2 accumulations as a magical illusion from within that state is action. If you make a living experience of this practice, it will continue in your dreams. If it comes in the dream state, it will come at the moment of death. And if it comes at the moment of death, it will come in the intermediate state. If it is present in the intermediate state, you may be certain of attaining supreme accomplishment. The 84,000 doors to the Dharma that the conqueror taught are thus all skillful means to cause the bodhicitta emptiness, of which compassion is the very essence, to arise in us. Right, so and I love that beautiful sort of connection between our actions in the world, right, our 6 parameters, the Eightfold Path, and emptiness. And so with that, then we transition from the sort of path of self-transformation, the more relative path, to self-transcendence, the result path. Right? So even as we've seen, even in the path of self-transformation, already we can start to practice emptiness. Right? We can apply the Supreme Three methods, as we just discussed. Right? We can start to visualize our actions as illusory, as magical. Right? We can start to break down the solidity of subject-object action. I strongly commend to you, it's actually free on Kensei Foundation's website, the Vimalakirti Sutra. It's a new translation by Robert Thurman with a wonderful introduction by Rinpoche, with a lot of non-dual teachings in it. And he emphasizes here, page 29, even the goal is illusory. So he says, if you have a goal, if your aim is to benefit or to achieve a result or a reward, you lack true renunciation, and therefore your activity is not genuine Dharma practice. That is not to say that being a monk like Rahula was an aimless, fruitless, or meaningless existence. The point here is that aimlessness is the aim. Basically, if you don't realize that the goal of your practice is an illusion, if you think it's real, and if your aspirations and actions in pursuit of that goal are based on a wrong view, whatever you do is not genuine Dharma practice. That's a really, really clear, really strong, right? Just for all of us. Yes, it's important in the relative truth to have aspiration, but always remind ourselves, if we have any truly existing goals, that is no longer Dharma. Right? So, that's a very tough thing to hold ourselves against, although I think it's an excellent test. But some other tests, I think we've talked to some of these before. How do we know the extent to which we're actually internalizing emptiness and realizing the view? Well, first, are we realizing the 8 worldly dharmas? Yeah, hope for happiness, fear of suffering, hope for fame, fear of insignificance, hope for praise, fear of blame, hope for gain, fear of loss. Now, we introduced those in week 1, right? But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of what it might mean to really apply the view of non-duality when those thoughts or emotions come up in your mind, right? Not just to fall prey to automatic, habitual samsaric actions that are pulled by these 8 worldly dharmas. As we saw last week, another way of testing is, do we have equanimity and preferencelessness when it comes to the paramitas, when it comes to the 4 immeasurables? And not just to people, right? Not just do we treat all people equally, but even to ideas. Are we open to ideas? Do we have beginner's mind? Another way we can test is, can we turn towards difficulties in our life? Difficult people, challenging ideas, challenging emotions, right? Do our hearts and minds stay open? Do we have generosity and an open heart? Do we have patience, fearlessness? Right? It's very hard to do our horse practice in a meaningful way unless we've made some genuine progress here. Okay, so moving on to self-transcendence then, just to offer a classic quote from Dogen, from the Genjo Koan. To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things of the universe. To be enlightened by all the things of the universe is to cast off the body and mind of the self, as well as those of others. Even the traces of enlightenment are wiped out, and life with traceless enlightenment goes on forever and ever. Okay, so we're starting to get, quite high here with these non-dual views. So I want to do something to really make sure our feet are on the ground. Now, I didn't really do this very much during the previous weeks of this program, but when Rinpoche was teaching Madhyamaka live, he would spend a lot of time teaching Lojong, teaching mind training, teaching renunciation, right? Really, and traditionally these are always taught alongside emptiness so that we don't forget the conventional truth, right? So that we don't lose our grounding. Because it's so easy to get caught up in this very non-dual language. And as we said at the beginning, if we do that, we'll end up spiritual bypassing, we'll end up with spiritual materialism, we'll just end up fooling ourselves. It'll just be an ego trip. I just want to read a few pieces from Rinpoche's, a lot from his book, Not for Happiness, but just a reminder, okay? So, as he said, Not for Happiness, this is, Dharma is not a therapy. It is such a mistake to assume that practicing Dharma will help us calm down and lead an untroubled life. Nothing could be further from the truth. Dharma is not a therapy. Quite the opposite, in fact. Dharma is tailored specifically to turn your life upside down. It's what you sign up for. And so just, I know in the past Rinpoche has said, look, the ideal is 20 years of Shravakayana practice, then 10 years of Mahayana, only then try and tackle Vajrayana. Because we really need this view of renunciation to be so much part of our blood that when we talk about things like Buddhist presidents and Buddhist CEOs and all the rest, there's no trace left of worldly ambition, right? Because the fear is for too many of us, we haven't really accomplished renunciation, right? So when we talk about practicing in the world, there's always that danger that our Dharma becomes subverted by our ego, right? And then like so much of contemporary mindfulness, it just becomes about success and power and happiness and all the rest, right? Okay, this one from a teaching in France in 2010 on Nagarjuna's letter to a friend. If any Dharma activity, including hearing the Dharma, becomes useful to your worldly life, then that is not good. Ideally, whatever the Dharma activity you engage with, in one way or another, must become a hindrance to this worldly life. Another from Not for Happiness. Once you understand that real Dharma practice is not just about formal sitting meditation, but a never-ending confrontation with and opposition to pride and ego, as well as a lesson in how to accept change, you will be able to start practicing right away. For example, imagine you're sitting on a beach admiring the sunset. Nothing terrible has happened and you're content, even happy. Then suddenly that little bell starts to ring in your head, reminding you this could be the last sunset you ever see. You realize were you to die, you might not be reborn with the ability to appreciate a sunset, let alone the capacity to understand what a sunset is. And this thought alone helps you focus your mind on your practice. So one more for Not for Happiness. The aim of far too many teachings these days is to make people feel good, and even some Buddhist masters are beginning to sound like New Age apostles. Their talks are entirely devoted to validating the manifestation of ego and endorsing the rightness of our feelings, neither of which has anything to do with the teachings we find in the Pith Instructions. So if you find you're only concerned about feeling good, you're far better off having a full body massage or listening to some uplifting or life-affirming music rather than receiving Dharma teachings, which were definitely not designed to cheer you up. On the contrary, the Dharma was devised specifically to expose your failings and make you feel awful. All right, so having said that, and please bear that in mind as we go forwards, I'll switch completely and really talk a little bit about what is more of the non-dual ethic, the Madhyamaka ethic. So back to where we started, the 10th bull. Just remember, barefooted and naked of breast, I mingle with the people of the world. My clothes are ragged and dust-laden, and I am ever blissful. I go to the marketplace with my wine bottle, return home with my staff. I visit the wine shop and market, and everyone I look upon becomes enlightened. And from Nagarjuna, as we said, for those who can accept emptiness, everything is acceptable. Another one from His Holiness Dudjom Rinpoche from Calling the Lama, he said, joyful in all action, the Dzogchen yogi, happy in any company. Right, so I think these three taken together, they really sum up the Madhyamaka ethic of non-duality, right? Which is the Dzogchen ethic, joyful in all action, happy in any company, right? And immediately you can see very much preferencelessness, equality, equanimity, turning towards acceptance, right? And we're also no longer caught up with worldly outcomes, health, wealth, success, happiness, all the rest, but nor is it a final resolution. Right? Rinpoche said in What Makes You Not a Buddhist, subconsciously we're lured by the expectation that we'll reach a stage where we don't have to fix anything ever again. One day we'll reach happily ever after. We're convinced of the notion of resolution. It's as if everything that we've experienced until now, our whole lives to this moment, was a dress rehearsal. We believe our grand performance is yet to come, so we do not live for today. Now, so this, again, all of this, very much, we need to test ourselves. We should aspire towards it, but be honest, right? As Milarepa said, my path is not deceiving myself. Are we really ready to renounce worldly outcomes, or are we still hoping the Dharma will bring us worldly happiness and success? I mean, Rinpoche often teaches the ideal of the Heruka, or the wanderer. And he says we should really practice outer, inner, and secret wandering. No stuckness on lifestyle or home, concepts, self-narratives, emotions, even awareness itself, right? Nothing should be stuck or settled. Again, Vimalakirti's Sutra, he said, the only way you can find the truth is by constantly having the rug pulled out from under your feet. And that means there's no time for settling. Yeah, and again, just really watch ourselves, all right? How many of us are busy spending our samsaric life building comfortable little nests for ourselves, right? A nest in relationship, a nest in our home, a nest in our workplace, somewhere padded and comfortable, a resting place, right? It's the exact opposite of what we should be doing as the Heruka, as the wanderer. So very challenging, right? How many of us are really ready for that? Okay, so we saw the Eightfold Noble Path in Walpola Rahula's version, the Shravakayana version from What the Buddha Taught, and now I'm going to turn to Trigam Trungpa Rinpoche from The Myth of Freedom. Right, beautiful book with so many pith instructions. I'm just going to pick out a few, but I really encourage you to read the book. And Rinpoche has said he considers it a terma, a revealed treasure. So with that in mind, right view, samadhi. Now we actually talked about this in week 6, but I'll just read it again. The first point the Buddha made has to do with right view. Wrong view is a matter of conceptualization. Someone is walking towards us, suddenly we freeze. Not only do we freeze ourselves, we also freeze the space in which this person is walking towards us. We call him friend, who is walking through the space, or enemy. Thus, the person is automatically walking through a frozen situation of fixed ideas. This is that, or this is not that. This is what the Buddha called wrong view. It is a conceptualized view which is imperfect because we do not see the situation as it is. There is the possibility, on the other hand, of not freezing that space. The person could walk into a lubricated situation of myself and that person as we are. Such a lubricated situation can exist and can create open space. Of course, openness could be appropriated as a philosophical concept as well, but the philosophy need not necessarily be fixed. The situation could be seen without the idea of lubrication as such, without any fixed idea. In other words, the philosophical attitude could be just to see the situation as it is. The person walking towards me is not a friend, therefore he's not an enemy either. He is just a person approaching me. I don't have to prejudge him at all. That is what is called right view. Okay, so I mean, look, we've been talking about this all of the last weeks, right? It's very much what it means to establish and practice the view of emptiness, right? So, really challenging ourselves all the time to notice the judgments we're making, which we make all the time. And is there a way we can avoid those dualistic judgments? Okay, second right intention, Sammasankappa. In order to see what this is, we must first understand what the Buddha meant by right. He did not mean to say right as opposed to wrong at all. He said right meaning what is, being right without a concept of what is right. Right translates the Sanskrit samyak, which means complete. Completeness needs no relative help, no support through comparison. It is self-sufficient. Samyak means seeing life as it is without crutches, straightforwardly. In a bar, one says, I would like a straight drink. Not diluted with club soda or water, you just have it straight. That is samyak. No dilutions, no concoctions, just a straight drink. Buddha realized that life could be potent and delicious, positive and creative, and he realized you do not need any concoctions with which to mix it. Life is a straight drink, hot pleasure, hot pain, straightforward, 100%. So right intention means not being inclined towards anything other than what is. You're not involved in the idea that life could be beautiful or could be painful. You're not being careful about life. According to Buddha, life is pain. Life is pleasure. That is the samyak quality of it, so precise and direct. Straight life without any concoctions. There is no need at all to reduce life situations or intensify them. Pleasure as it is, pain as it is. These are the absolute qualities of the Buddha's approach to intention. So again, some really important non-dual teachings here, right? So the idea of right, which we use throughout the Eightfold Path, right meaning beyond right and wrong. We saw last week the idea that the Shantongpas use permanent when they describe Buddha qualities, but in a way that's beyond both permanent and impermanent, right? It's a way of pointing to non-duality. Likewise, right intention means beyond intention, right? Intention is about preference, about subject-object action. As Rinpoche said, we cannot have a goal, an aspiration. So how do we manifest our intention then? As we saw in chapter 11, we shine like the sun, right, without an intention. And I love this line where he says, you're not being careful about life. Life is pain. Life is pleasure. So precise and direct. And on that basis, I would like to offer Roosevelt's Man in the Arena, very similar. He says, it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with the cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. That's so very similar, right, to Trungpa's idea, and I think so important for us as aspiring bodhisattvas, how, not just sitting and debating intellectual emptiness, but throwing ourselves into our practice, into our lives. So right speech, samavaka. The third aspect of the Eightfold Path is right speech. In Sanskrit, the word for speech is vak, which means utterance, word, or logos. It implies perfect communication, communication which says, it is so, rather than I think it is so. Fire is hot, rather than I think firing is hot. It is just the simple minimum of words we could use. It is true. So, I'm not going to go into detail here, but there's really good work on speech acts by John Searle and John Austin. So if you're interested, I strongly encourage you to read that. It's all about clarity and accountability in communication. Now, if you think about it, so much of our communication, again, written or verbal, we get caught in our hopes, our fears, our projections, our defilements. Right? Just think of trying to say something difficult to someone. Think of asking someone out on a date. Think of the big presentation you have to make, right? We so quickly become so indirect, so unsure, not right speech. Now, so again, the emptiness is all about stripping out all of those extraneous emotions and wrong views. So a really good test in practice is, are you able to speak directly? Do you have that courage? Because if not, ask yourself, how is that evidence of your defilements, of your wrong views, which you can then incorporate into your practice? Okay, 4, right morality or right discipline or right action. So Summa Kamanta. Trungpa says, if there is no one to impose discipline and no one to impose discipline on, then there is no need for discipline in the ordinary sense at all. Ordinary discipline exists only at the level of relative decisions. If there is a tree, there must be branches. However, if there's no tree, there are no such things as branches. Likewise, if there's no ego, a whole range of projections becomes unnecessary. Right discipline is that kind of giving up process. It brings us into complete simplicity. We're all familiar with the samsaric kind of discipline, which is aimed at self-improvement. We give up in all kinds of things in order to make ourselves better, which provides us with tremendous reassurance that we can do something with our lives. Such forms of discipline are just unnecessarily complicating your life rather than trying to simplify and live the life of a rishi. Rishi is a Sanskrit word which refers to a person who constantly leads a straightforward life. The Tibetan word for rishi is Trung Song, which means, where Trung means direct and Song means upright. Refers to someone who leads a direct and upright life by not introducing new complications. Yeah, so very relevant for us, right? Not overcomplicating our external worlds, our lives, our commitments, so that we don't have time for practice. Right? Again, a lovely quote here on simplicity and kind of directness, attributed to Goethe. Until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elemental truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans, that the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves all. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings, and material assistance which no man would have dreamed would have come his way. Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Begin it now. Okay, so right livelihood, Sama Ajiva. Yeah, and we saw that in the Shravagayana, the presentation is much more about avoiding certain kinds of work, which are sort of seen as bad. But Trungpa Rinpoche, he's not looking so much at the kinds of work, but the whole idea of work, the whole idea of engaging in the world. And here he says, right livelihood simply means making money by working, earning dollars, pounds, francs, pesos. To buy food and pay rent, you need money. It's not a cruel imposition on us. It is a natural situation. We need not be embarrassed by dealing with money, nor resent having to work. The more energy you put out, the more you get in. Earning money involves you in so many related situations that it permeates your whole life. Avoiding work is related to avoiding other aspects of life as well. People who reject materialism of American society and set themselves apart from it are unwilling to face themselves. They'd like to comfort themselves with the notion they're leading philosophically virtuous lives rather than realizing that they are unwilling to work with the world as it is. Yeah, so very super important advice, right? Because many of us are tempted to indulge in sort of, slightly left-wing political fantasies. We're down on materialism, we're down on work, we're down on capitalism. And as Trungpa's saying, well, that kind of mindset is an unwillingness to work with the world as it is. Rinpoche told a very funny story many years ago where he was once working in London Soho, handing out advertisements for escort services. Just to practice his own right livelihood. And he said he was so terrified that someone Tibetan or Bhutanese might see him. In Trungpa's book, Work, Sex, Money, Chapter 1 on Sacred Society, expands on this idea. As Buddhist practitioners and practitioners of meditation, we're supposed to be immersed in the contemplative tradition and spiritual practice. Why would we discuss work, sex, money? If you're involved in spirituality, you may think you should transcend work, sex, and money. Perhaps you think you should live the contemplative life, a life in which those things don't apply because you spend the whole day meditating. You should have nothing to do with those things. You shouldn't have to think about work. Nobody should be involved with sex because people shouldn't have such lustful thoughts at all while living the contemplative life of meditation. And money, you should be involved with that least of all. What money? Who has any anyhow? Money, that's the last thing we should think about. But then the question is, are we really working on spirituality or not? If so, there is something that we might not have thought about, that spirituality isn't really spirituality in an idealized sense. Do you think spirituality is something purely transcendental? Well, it's questionable. Real spirituality might have something to do with ordinary life. Spirituality does have something to do with ordinary life situations, then relating to spirituality means contributing something to society as a whole. And we have to associate with society in order to offer something to society. For some people, that is not an easy thing to accept or do at all. Yeah, so, as you said, never giving up on samsara, never giving up on sentient beings, reminding ourselves everything is acceptable, and reminding ourselves that, the idea that samsara and nirvana are somehow separate, that is a wrong view. I know we've refuted this in previous weeks, but there's something about, the topics of work, sex, money, very nice. It's not abstractions, it's very real. And for most of us, that's where all of our ego and insecurity and aspiration and hope and fear and ambition and emotion, all of that comes up, right? So work, sex, money, just look at those areas in your life, right? Again, how much has emptiness permeated those? So number 6, right effort, samma vayama. There is no need to be continually just pushing along, drudging along. If you are awake and open in living situations, it is possible for them and you to be creative, beautiful, humorous, and delightful. This natural openness is right effort, as opposed to any old effort. Right effort is seeing a situation precisely as it is at that very moment, being present fully, with delight, with a grin. So again, just like joyful in all action, the Dzogchen yogi, happy in any company. So right mindfulness, right samadhi, actually, as you may know, in the Dzogchen Mahamudra traditions, they really merge into a union of the two. So these two sound quite similar, but let's hear them. Right mindfulness, samasati. Right mindfulness does not simply mean being aware. It's like creating a work of art. There is more spaciousness in right mindfulness than in right effort. If you're drinking a cup of tea, you're aware of the whole environment as well as the cup of tea. You can therefore trust what you are doing. You're not threatened by anything. You have room to dance in the space, and this makes it a creative situation. The space is open to you. Yeah, so again, we talked about in week 6, non-dual and dual awareness, very similar. Number 8, right samadhi, right concentration. So sama samadhi. Samadhi has the sense of being as it is, which means relating with the space of a situation. This pertains to one's living situation as well as to sitting meditation. Right absorption is being completely involved, thoroughly and fully in a non-dualistic way. In sitting meditation, the technique and you are one. In life situations, the phenomenal world is also part of you. Therefore, you do not have to meditate as such, as though you were a person distinct from the act of meditating and the object of meditation. If you are one with the living situation as it is, your meditation just automatically happens. Okay, so again, as we said in the past, a lot of these non-dual ways of seeing it, they may seem a little beyond us right now, but just, I think it's important to understand that we can approach even, the most foundational teachings of the Eightfold Noble Path from this non-dual perspective. And likewise with the paramitas, right? We've already talked about it from the Where's My Perfect Teacher, but just I'd like to go through Trungpa as well. She does a beautiful job here. So first, generosity, dana paramita. Thus, the Bodhisattva at the level of the first bhumi develops generosity. He's not acting generously in order to get something in return. He's just being generous and warm. If you're acting kindly to someone in the conventional sense, it has the connotation of looking down upon someone lower, less fortunate than you. I am rich because you need help because you're not like me. The Bodhisattva's generosity need not be gentle and soothing. It could be very violent or sharp because he gives you what you need rather than what will please you superficially. He does not expect anything in return at all. He can be generous physically, giving food, wealth, clothes, and shelter, or spiritually, giving food for the mind, restoring your mental health. The best kind of generosity, according to the scriptures, is that of working with another person's state of mind. But the Bodhisattva does not go beyond his own understanding. He regards himself as a student rather than as a teacher. Nor does he try to seduce the object of his generosity. He is aware not only of me and them, but also of the space that both the giver and the receiver are sharing. The perception of the shared space is the operation of the sharp intelligence of prajna. So yeah, lovely, right? This idea that we give what the person wants, also what they need, right? There's no sense of looking down, no sense of being a teacher, no sense of being superior, right? No dualistic framing at all. Not even the framing of being a peer, right? It's, as he says, just being generous and warm. It's like with equanimity, just as we said, like the shining of the sun. Or back to the 10 Bulls, everyone I look upon becomes enlightened. So discipline, Shila Paramita. So morality or discipline. The purity of the bodhisattva retorted by Srila Paramita is based upon making friends with oneself, loving oneself. You're not a nuisance to yourself anymore. You're good company, an inspiration to yourself. You do not have to control yourself to avoid temptations or follow rules or laws. You find temptations less relevant and guidelines less necessary because you naturally follow the appropriate patterns. There is no need to try to be pure, to painfully discipline yourself to be pure, to apply detergent to your natural condition. The Bodhisattva delights in working with people rather than regarding compassionate action as a duty. He has no dogma about how he should act or how other people should be. He does not try to reform or transform anyone because they do not fit his model. If people are determined to convert others into their mold, then they are attempting to reassure themselves by using the convert to relieve their doubt. The Bodhisattva is not concerned with conversion. He respects others' lifestyles, speaks their language, and allows them to evolve according to their nature rather than making them into a replica of himself. So again, lots of emptiness teachings here, right? So the first, this idea that, as Prabhupada says, making friends with yourself, right? Loving yourself, coming to peace with yourself. Very much remind me of the story of Milarepa and the demons in the cave, right? As long as we see evil out there, or even evil in here, it's all our dualistic projection, right? So in the same way that a good therapist has to do work so that they don't get caught up in, transference and countertransference, we need to make peace with ourselves and our narratives so that we're not projecting our confusion onto other people and then trying to fix our confused projections. The Bodhisattva delights in working with people, again, like before, shining like the sun. No dogma how to act or to live, right? No right lifestyle or path. Yeah, so really, again, another super important application of emptiness, right? Do we delight in all people, right? Could be practitioners, kings, prostitutes, soldiers, Wall Street bankers, people who are very different in their political views. And for those of us who are anti-business, anti-science, anti-Republican, right, we need to remember their lifestyle is every bit as valid as ours. And if we reject it, we are not practicing emptiness. All right, patience, Kshanti Paramita. Patience is related to the idea that the Bodhisattva does not desire to be a Buddha, but would rather work with sentient beings to save them from their confusion. Patience also implies heroism in the sense of having nothing to lose. The meditation practice concerned with patience is working with territory. There's no territory that is yours or that is others. Everyone is in no man's land. Not seeking enlightenment for ego's personal benefit, you have no need for territory. You're free to do anything there. No one can make any demands upon you, so you can afford to wait to be patient. Patience does not mean forbearance in the sense of enduring pain, allowing someone to torture you at his leisure. The Bodhisattva can spring out like a tiger and claw you, bite you, crush you. He is not inhibited by conventional morality or idiot compassion. He is not afraid to subjugate what needs to be subjugated, to destroy what needs to be destroyed, and to welcome that which needs to be welcomed. So again, really important. So yes, patience in the Travakayana was about non-reactivity, dealing with anger in a skillful way. And here we also have non-reactivity, but in a very different way, right? Because, as we saw in the Where's My Perfect Teacher, there's nothing to lose, nothing to defend, right? Most of our reactivity is fear-driven. It's protecting ego. It's protecting things that are me and mine. But once we've transcended that, no need to be reactive. And likewise, I love this idea, patience as in no desire for enlightenment, right? Just like chapter 11, where it ends with Chandrakirti saying, the Buddha chose not even to become enlightened out of his compassion. Or Rinpoche's wonderful story of the Casablanca coffee shop, right? Where the Bodhisattva will take all the time he needs to make sure he engages in precisely the right action, right? That kind of patience. So back to Guru Rinpoche's action as fine as flower, never in a hurry, never missing what's important. So again, just for us, noticing our own tendency to rush and speed through life, right? Do we have this kind of patience? Very much as in emptiness practice. Okay, diligence, Virya Paramita. Virya is taking delight in working hard with whatever working based on material we're presented with. Our state of mind, our traditions, our society. It's not taking sides for or against our traditions or our state of mind. It is taking delight in them and then working with them. It's not enough to reject superficially the different aspects of the world around us. It's too simple-minded just to abandon traditional morality as being old-fashioned, like an old clothing style, and then substitute an swinging, up-to-date kind of morality. Many young people reject tradition altogether, even the smell of it. They see no truth in it at all. They say, I'm unhappy, neurotic because of them, my parents, my teachers, the media, the politicians, the psychiatrists, the capitalists, the clergymen, the computers, the scientists. We denounce the government, the schools, the churches, the synagogues, the hospitals. And yet there is some uncertainty in this stance. Perhaps there could be some truth in what the establishment says and the way it does things. I think this next part is very important. Sanity lies somewhere between the inhibitions of conventional morality and the looseness of extreme impulse. But the area in between is very fuzzy. The Bodhisattva delights in the play between hesitation and extreme impulsiveness. It is beautiful to look at. Delight in itself is the approach of sanity. Delight is to open our eyes to the totality of the situation rather than siding with this or that point of view. The Bodhisattva does not side with rejecting convention, mocking everything out of sheer frustration, trying to get the world to acknowledge him, nor does he side with blind dogma, holding back out of fear, trying to mold the world to conform to rigid ideas and rules. The Bodhisattva takes delight in polarities, but does not side with any extreme. So again, love this, right? No accountability, no blame, really taking accountability, right? Self-authorship, no rebellion, right? Internalizing the view, clearly elegance and outrageousness. I love this idea of hesitation and impulsiveness. We are noticing that for ourselves. How does that show up in our lives? I particularly love that final line. The Bodhisattva takes delight in polarities and does not side with any extreme. That's a really great teaching for our own lives, right? I mean, our lives are filled with polarities, but in most cases we tend to pick one extreme, right? How can we learn, as we said earlier with conflict, how can we learn to delight in the polarity, to see both sides, to transcend just our narrow dualistic stance? I mean, not just the 8 worldly dharmas, as we said, but any aspect of a view, a position, a person. Okay, the 5th meditation, Dhyana Paramita. Here it's panoramic awareness, right, which is dhyana in Indian tradition, chan in the Chinese tradition, zen in the Japanese tradition. They all mean a state of total involvement without center or fringe. Because if there's a center and a fringe, our state of mind ceases to be one of total involvement because we now have to keep track of both ends. A sense of polarity is always present. So dhyana or zen is awareness without a watcher. In the superficial sense, when we speak of awareness, we mean egocentric watching, knowing what we're doing, knowing where we're supposed to be and how we handle the situation. It's quite a complicated process. We have to keep track of ourselves and our situation. Awareness in the sense of Zen is much simpler. The Tibetan word is samten. Sam means awareness, ten means making stable. Samten just means stable awareness, sane awareness rather than neurotic awareness. Awareness in the sense there are very few things to keep track of because everything has been simplified into one situation. Now, so again, we talked about dual and non-dual awareness before. And as we said then and again here, very different from contemporary mindfulness teachings, which are very dualistic. And really the focus on simplicity. Right? Like a lot of Dzogchen advice on non-duality, I mean, Rinpoche often says the reason we can't realize the non-dual teachings is because they're too simple. Right? We miss them because we're so busy creating complications. Right, finally, wisdom, prajna paramita. Right, we spent the whole of chapter 6 on this, but just in summary, Rinpoche says, prajna cuts through the pieties of the Bodhisattva's approach, being extraordinarily compassionate, being smooth and skillful, able to handle any situation, the syrupy, honey-like quality of the Bodhisattva, being sweet and kind and gentle, and at the same time slippery. Prajna cuts through any subtle attitude, any sense of virtue or manipulation, any sense of fixed concepts. Right, that's what I love about this, going back to Jay Garfield's point about, Buddhist ethics being about changing the narrative. things we've talked about in previous weeks about the baseless self and the narrative. So here I love the Trungpa Rinpoche. When he talks about prajna, is going straight for our self-narrative, right? And in particular, counseling us not to get caught in these romantic and egoic self-narratives of us as bodhisattvas or practitioners, just another ego trip. Yeah, so supremely important. Yeah, I wanted to give also a few words of practice advice that I've heard from Rinpoche over the years. So in no particular order, I mean, these are just pithy. As soon as we give up thinking how it should be, everything works. In your action, try not to upset others. Right? Be an ideal husband, or consultant, or artist, whatever. Don't burn the nose of others. But when it matters, be like a silk scarf tied round a rock of iron. So although you are following others' ideas of how things should be, you are now free. You have the view. You can do whatever you like. You look at the mirage, and you know it's a mirage. Then you can decide if you want to go and get water. You can go if you want, but because you have the view, you won't be disappointed if you don't find any. How to act? So I asked Rinpoche this question. He said, act with nothing to abandon, nothing to adopt, no hope, no fear. He said in particular, we should always be careful not to act with the intention of flattering people or getting people to like us. Better to be honest and straightforward. Be genuine. And even when it comes to cultivating virtues, even the virtue of humility and devotion, he said, don't fall into the trap or burden of getting stuck there. We need good qualities, but we must not get stuck with them. And two core pieces of advice I'll come to in a moment. He says, nothing to abandon, nothing to adopt. So very non-dual. And the other one, if it comes, don't suppress it. And that second one in particular, I love that. And I spent many years trying to, I use it almost as a koan for myself, right, to try and understand its meaning. I strongly recommend it to you. It's wonderful. Rinpoche also told the story of Aryadeva's teaching, where he said, training in emptiness is like dipping your jacket in a vat of acid. Once you remove the jacket, it will still have the shape of a jacket as before, but all the individual cells of the fabric will have fallen apart. And then one day, your master will come and shake you, and the jacket will simply fall apart. So, again, I love that, and I think it goes back to what we talked about in previous weeks about the path, being nonlinear. But just this practice of emptiness, if we persist with it, it has this quality of breaking apart our structure so that one day our teacher will say the right word, just like Patrul Rinpoche and Nyuchen Longtok, can you see the stars? And at that moment, our jacket will fall apart. So we're just going to transition now to just the final stage of really thinking of pure perception and spontaneous action. I just want to give a couple of quotes just to set that up. So first from Wisława Szymborska, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in '96. And she said, the world, whatever we might think when terrified by its vastness and our own impotence, or embittered by its indifference to individual suffering of peoples, animals, perhaps even plants, and why are we so sure the plants feel no pain? Whatever we might think of its expanses pierced by the rays of stars, surrounded by planets we've just begun to discover, planets already dead, still dead, we just don't know. Whatever we might think of this measureless theater to which we've got reserved tickets, but tickets whose lifespan is laughably short, bounded as it is by 2 arbitrary dates. Whatever else we might think of this world, it is astonishing. But astonishing is an epithet concealing a logical trap. We're astonished, after all, by things that deviate from some well-known and universally acknowledged norm, from an obviousness we've grown accustomed to. Now, the point is there is no such obvious world. our astonishment exists per se and isn't based on comparison with something else. Granted, in daily speech, where we don't stop to consider every word, we all use phrases like the ordinary world, ordinary life, the ordinary course of events. But in the language of poetry, where every word is weighed, nothing is usual or normal. Not a single stone and not a single cloud above it. Not a single day and not a single night after it. And above all, not a single existence, not anyone's existence in the world. Another one I'd like to offer is William Blake from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. Right, so we come to the third and final part, spontaneous action, right? The spontaneity of the Dzogchen yogi, of the sage. And I think, in thinking about spontaneous action, it's good to bear in mind, like live performance, like live jazz, right, or improv. I mean, if you've seen live performances, you know that the artists, the musicians, they know what to do, right? And they've had their equivalent of the 10,000 hours of training. They have mastery. No shortcuts, right? They have all the skills they need to be creative, self-expressed, spontaneous. Right, but don't fool yourself, right? You can't get up on stage and play jazz unless you master your instrument, right? So it's the same here, right? When we think about the spontaneous action of the yogi, we have to do our training. Right, so as Aristotle said, right, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, therefore, is not an act, but a habit. It's a lovely quote I love from Robert Pirsig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And he said, do you want to know how to paint a perfect painting? It's easy. Make yourself perfect and then just paint naturally. I mean, I absolutely love that, right? That's exactly the idea of spontaneous action, right? A couple more. Doris Lessing. Whatever you're meant to do, do it now. The conditions are always impossible. And then finally, I mean, I love this as a completely non-dual example from Anton Chekhov, like beyond words or concepts, which is very much the way of the Dzogchen yogi. He says, don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. And so, I mentioned earlier Rinpoche's wonderful words of if it comes, don't suppress it. Nothing to abandon, nothing to adopt. I mean, those of you who've received Dzogchen teachings or read any Longchenpa, you will know these come from Longchenpa himself, right? From the Precious Treasury. When he says, with the pacification of all value judgments, there is abiding in the ultimate heart essence. Do not suppress objects that manifest. He even goes on, the way things arise without beginning or end cannot be suppressed. The nature of mind is natural great perfection. I pay homage to this with nothing to discard or adopt. And I mean, I'd like to close with one of His Holiness Dudjom Rinpoche's prayers, calling the Lama from afar. So, as you know, he's Rinpoche's grandfather. I won't read the whole thing, but just a few verses, because it really is a beautiful Dzogchen prayer, and a prayer that really incorporates non-duality at its core. The essence is the primordially unchanging nature, free from mental activity, dwelling in the originally pure, youthful vase body of profound inner luminosity. Dhammakaya Lama Yeshe Dorje, care for me. Please bestow the blessing of obtaining great confidence in the view. The uncreated nature is the unobstructed, indivisibly united radiant mandala gathering, dwelling in the display of the spontaneously accomplished five certainties. Sambhogakaya Lama Dechen Dorje, care for me. Please bestow the blessing of perfectly great skill in meditation. The compassion is the wisdom, free from falling into bias, liberated from extremes, dwelling in the naked essence, the all-pervading Rigpa emptiness. Nirmanakaya Lama Jodolingpa, care for me. Please bestow the blessing of greater skill in activity. The primordial ground of self-awareness is unmoving and unchanging. The Dhammakaya's efflorescence of whatever arises is neither good nor bad. Since pure awareness of nowness is the real Buddha, in openness and contentment we find the Lama in our heart. When we realize that this unending natural mind is the nature of the Lama, there is no need for attached and grasping prayers or artificial complaints. By relaxing in uncontrived awareness, the free and open natural state, we obtain the blessing of aimless self-liberation of whatever arises. Buddhahood is not attained by fabricated dharmas. Meditation made by the mind, fabricated by the intellect, is the deceiving enemy. Now, clinging to style and manner is destroyed with crazy abandon. Let this life be spent in this state of uninhibited naked ease. And so with that we come to an end, and I really wish that for all of you. Let this life be spent in the state of uninhibited naked ease. I really hope that our time together has helped establish the view of emptiness for you, and I sincerely hope that you are inspired to go and practice to attain this result. I would like to offer a dedication. So whatever merit we may have gained during the last 8 weeks, including whatever understanding we may have, whatever inspiration to practice, whatever gratitude to Rinpoche, to the teachings, to the teachers, may we dedicate this to the enlightenment of all sentient beings. And just once again, I'll close with that dedication prayer from the Bodhicharyavatara. And now, as long as space endures, as long as there are beings to be found, may I continue likewise to remain, to drive away the sorrows of the world. And with that, I thank you very much. I wish you the very best and look forward to our paths crossing again in the future. Good evening.